Professor James Orr, happy Easter.
Happy Easter to you, Calvin. Good to be with you.
Some people say Easter is a pagan festival. How do you react to that? Is it actually Christian? And what is the history, the original history of Easter?
So history is not like science. Science studies the repeatable. History studies the unique, the one-off, the unrepeatable. But the documents advance a set of claims, a set of purported facts that build up a picture of the Easter events as having a historical core. And Paul is quite clear about that. He says, either this stuff is true, either these historical claims are true, in which case our faith is vindicated, or they're not, in which case we're to be pitied.
Well, in most other languages, if not all other languages, the word for Easter comes from the Passover. And in English, it's obviously not, but we do have the Paschal candle. Could it be the English word Easter that causes a lot of this misinformation?
Yes, I think so. It probably lends a certain sort of Saxon quality to it. There's sort of the idea that somehow the Easter is a festival or sort of set of myths that is native to pre-Christian Britain, and that Christianity somehow hijacked and took over and reworked, as indeed it has done in the case of certain myths and local traditions. Christianity has always had a peculiar genius to sort of cloaking itself in sort of pagan ideas and pagan myths. I mean, it's interesting that probably the most famous convert in the Anglican tradition of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis, bought this parallelism completely. In fact, he describes his conversion as being motivated by Tolkien and others convincing him that these pagan dying and rising god fertility myths were a sort of providential prefiguring of what did in fact happen. So it was a sort of, the idea was that human beings were being sort of prepared anthropologically and through their sort of rituals and customs and mythographies to kind of be ready for the true thing when it came. This is his famous sermon or essay, I can't remember, that myth became fact.
Like with Aristotle.
Yes, that's right. That's the idea that there are sort of intimations of Christianity among the ancient Greeks, as Simone Weil put it. But as I said, you've got to take the texts at face value. You've got to apply the principle of charity, and the text asks us to take them as historical claims that are refutable, and if refuted, Christianity crumbles, as Paul insists, and if not, if they stand, then Christianity stands too. And Christianity is quite peculiar and unusual as a religion, as one of the great religions, that in resting itself and founding itself on these historical claims.
Well, you mentioned a moment ago that if it's not true, we should be pitied, and you've alluded to what St. Paul said. He said, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. What do you think he actually meant by this?
Well, Calvin, you're the priest, so I'd rather hear what you have to say about it. But what I would understand it to mean is that the resurrection is an act, a divine act, that doesn't just happen to anyone. So it's if one of the thieves who was crucified next to Jesus had been resurrected, then we'd say, well, the world's a bit of an old place, but we're not quite sure what to do with that, and even if the evidence is very strong. I think the point about the Easter events is that it's an extraordinary miracle that happens to this particular person who taught these particular things and did these particular things. And so I think what we're to understand by that is that God is, as it were, leaving his stamp, his sort of vindicating signature on the life and teachings of this particular man.
And Christ's death on the cross, how does that relate to the theological virtue of charity? And what is charity?
Well, charity as it's understood today, I mean, it means, all sorts of things. I mean, it comes from the Latin word caritas. Caritas is typically the word that translates the Greek word agape, which, means roughly a universal loving regard for all human beings just in virtue of the fact that they are human beings. that in itself, that very idea, is an idea that is nothing less than revolutionary in the grand sweep of the moral history of humanity. The idea that what you might think of as the invention of human beings. It's very odd for us to think in a world dominated by the language of human rights and the language of human dignity. We just take this as part of the air we breathe. But once upon a time, there were no human beings, in the sense that humanity and human beings wasn't seen as a sort of category to which, where every member was owed an equal and infinite regard. The Athenians thought of themselves as Athenians and everyone else as barbaroi, barbarians. The Romans thought of themselves as Romans, inasmuch as you had the legal status of Roman citizenship, and the rest were literally not persons, did not have legal persona, and so on and so forth. It's true that the Stoics had some sense of there being a kind of collective humanity, but there was a sort of a cosmopolitanism, as it's sometimes called, within Stoicism. But in the end, Stoicism is a pretty aristocratic way of thinking, and it never really got down to, it never really transcended sort of social classes and ethnicities as in the way that Christianity did very, very quickly and very, very early on. The most, what we can learn a lot about the Christians from the way the Romans saw them, the way their enemies saw them. Their enemies saw them as profoundly subversive politically because of this sort of radically inclusive moral vision that they ushered in. They saw them as atheists because Christians refused to burn their pinch of incense to Caesar, refused to recognize as ultimate the gods of the Roman pantheon that upheld the civic religion. Pliny, an early writer from early 2nd century, writes in a letter to the Emperor Trajan that these early Christians also seem to be cannibals. They're sort of eating their God, and they're celebrating on the first day of the week, Sunday. This is profoundly puzzling. It marked them off from Jewish the Jewish tradition. So they couldn't make sense of them as a Jewish sect of Judaism. They're not meeting on the Sabbath. They're meeting on a Sunday. This is quite an early fact we know about the early Christians. Why Sunday? If it was the case, as some insist, that the resurrection belief is a later legend that sort of accumulates over time, it's a kind of myth that grows up, it wouldn't make sense of why Sunday is the day chosen as the holiest day of the week. You would expect Friday to be the day. Friday, after all, is the day on which Jesus is crucified and, as it were, the event of atonement occurs. But it's not Friday, it's Sunday. Something must explain why there's this extraordinary change of practice from treating the Sabbath, the Saturday, as holy day, and all of the early Christians, of course, were devout Jews. Why is it that they surrendered not just any old sort of practice buried deep in the book of Leviticus, but the Sabbath, a mosaic, a command of the Decalogue, one of the most important and unbreakable commands, divine command. But we know they shifted that. They abandoned animal sacrifice. They abandoned Sabbath as the holiest day of the week, and they shift to Sunday. So again, that's one of the little details, one of the facts that's very, very difficult to sort of do away with. It's very, very difficult to explain in terms of mythology and legend, and it lends itself much more to historical analysis. Now, of course, I've spoken with a lot of atheist friends, and you can run them through the case for the historicity of the resurrection, and they'll say, as one of my friends said to me the other day, well, I don't care. Dead people stay dead. I said, so well, look, if I showed you a DVD, or if I somehow transported you in time to the garden on Easter morning, and you just saw it with your own eyes, would that be enough evidence?
No, they'd have to touch it.
Well, wouldn't even have to touch it. I mean, the response was no. I'd say I was hallucinating. And so, these sorts of historical exercises in historical apologetics have some value, but in the end, one does actually have to accept that there's, assign some degree of credence and probability to there being a God who might have wanted to leave his vindicating signature on the processes of history in some dramatic public way. Of course, if you think that there just couldn't be such a thing as God and that all truths are scientific truths and that they cannot be, that the miraculous is a priori impossible, then you're not going to be convinced by any of these. Similarly, I think there's probably a risk of treating, just only doing sort of historical apologetics and forgetting that the resurrection is not just a historical event. If it is what Christians believe it to be, it is both history, but also it transcends history. It's the fulcrum of history. It's the most cosmically significant event in human history, in all history. It's a moment of recreation. I love the way G.K. Chesterton describes this, the moment of the apostles sort of stepping in to the garden on Easter morning and saying, what they saw was a moment of new creation or recreation, a new heaven, a new earth, a time in which God walked again as a gardener, this time not in the cool of the evening, but of the dawn.
That's lovely. It is the greatest miracle since creation. I like your definition of why Sunday is the Lord's Day. That's very articulate. But you also touched on the idea that perhaps universal human rights come from agape. Would you say that's the case?
The history of human rights, where they come from, how we're to think of them, how theologically freighted they are, or how unique they are to the secular liberal enlightenment, is highly contested. The metaphor of right, and it is a metaphor drawn from the world of property law, in effect Roman property law. You had a jus, you had a right over your property, and that's come to mean a certain sort of moral right or some sort of constitutive ingredient in what it is to have human dignity. I mean, yes, I think it certainly presupposes a way of thinking about the infinite and intrinsic dignity of human beings that would have been strange, subversive, and frankly offensive to a moral consciousness, that a world in which the Easter events and the Christian moral revolution had never occurred. This is going back to my point about the invention of the human. This way of thinking about all human beings as having and sharing in an equal and infinite dignity. This is, as I said, the air in which we breathe, and yet it's a very, very strange and, as I said, subversive, politically subversive ingredient in the early Christians, and one of the reasons they insisted on that they were persecuted. There's a wonderful, quite famous letter that Julian the Apostate in the early 360s AD writes to one of his governors in Bithynia, modern-day Turkey, and the people in Bithynia are going through a plague. And he berates this governor, saying, look, you've got to improve the help and assistance you're giving to the plague victims, because you've got these Galileans, these Christians, who are helping not only their own victims, but ours as well. And that's a sort of early charity in action. But this is just unthinkable to Julian. Julian recognized how subversive it was and how effective it would be as a recruiting sergeant for the Galileans. But we know from other evidence that this was a feature, a consistent feature of early Christian practices, that you would give help to, rescue those who are outside your tribe, who didn't sign up to what you believed.
You've talked about your atheist friends, but thinking broader afield to all of your non-Christian friends, can non-Christians derive something from Easter?
That's a really interesting question. I suppose, the Easter message is a message of hope, and perhaps to the agnostic who's open to the truth of Christianity, but basically unconvinced, there might be a sense in which, I can't be certain about this, but maybe I can hope that it's true. And maybe it can give me a sense of confidence in new life. Maybe it could give me a sense that the claim that biological death is not death is true. But I think, in the end, one of the reasons we see this sort of reversion to parallelomania and this insistence that, the way we should understand Easter is in the context of sort of pagan myths. And that probably suggests that the way that non-Christians in fact are prone to take it is in something like a neo-pagan way. Oh, it's a mark of spring, new life, the eternal cycle of, or the rhythms of nature. The reality is that insofar as a post-Christian world thinks about Easter at all, it's probably in the sense of marking, in a kind of neo-pagan way, as marking, the sort of ceaseless rhythms of nature, and in a world in which ecological concerns are weightier and weightier, and nature is seen more as our mother than as our sibling. I think that sort of those neo-pagan elements and dimensions of the parallelism between Easter and these fertility cults and dying and rising god myths is more pronounced than it used to be.
And James, how do you think Christianity or the Christian story shaped our society, and do we need to reclaim that story?
I'm not sure your Easter special is long enough, anywhere near long enough to answer that question. It's almost an unanswerable question. I mean, it's a little bit like asking the goldfish what the water's like. That is to say, we live in a world, a moral universe, we live in a world of technology and of politics and law that is so freighted, is so saturated with Christian assumptions that it's almost difficult for us to step outside it and begin to answer that question. That said, I think, and I sense, a fresh hostility to certain Christian claims, particularly certain Christian ethical claims, in the last 10, 15 years, which I think Christians could probably welcome, in as much as that hostility starts to help Christians to differentiate themselves from wider society. I think there's an American writer, Aaron Renn, who I admire a great deal, who talks about this shift from sort of negative world, from neutral world, to negative world. So there's sort of period in which Christianity is regarded with basic indifference and sort of neutrality. I think we're shifting more into a world in which there is quite outspoken hostility and suspicion towards Christians. Just look at what Kate Forbes up in Scotland has been put through in recent months just for cleaving to fairly mainstream, historically orthodox positions on marriage. And I think what that means is that Christianity is getting a bit stranger and more distinctive, and that's probably not a bad thing, in fact. I'd say it's probably regarded as stranger and as more distinctive than it has been since the early centuries of the first millennium. So these are exciting times for Christians.
Plus, it's a faith that thrives under persecution, and it was prophesied that we would be persecuted, but we would be blessed because of it. James, how will you and your family be celebrating Easter this year?
Well, I have the amazing good fortune of celebrating Easter this year with my wife in the garden tomb. I think there's some controversy as to whether or not the garden tomb is in fact the tomb, the empty tomb, but we're going to be marking it in a very special way with services early, just before dawn, in the garden tomb, and that's part of an enterprise planned by some friends, and I'm looking forward to that immensely. I've never set foot in Jerusalem, and but what a wonderful way to experience it. What a wonderful context in which to experience it. It'll be 10 years exactly from the moment at which the real millennium, the second millennium of the resurrection, is going to be marked on Easter Sunday 2033, which is the date that I think most scholars agree was the moment at which Jesus emerges from the tomb.
Easter in the Holy Land. Well, enjoy. Thank you for coming on today, and God bless you.
It's a pleasure.